The list of those who spent the last 4 years shouting into the void, lone voices braving the roaring hurricane of ridicule and censorship and worse, is a long one. This week, a stubborn, highly credentialed expert, one of those so maligned, spoke at a conference organised in Austria by an association speaking up for those injured by the products pushed, labelled as COVID vaccines. He's just one, of course, one man, one of the many continuing to shout, having long since paid the price for so doing. Reputations hard won after years of work have been utterly destroyed because the human beings behind those reputations refused to toe the line, refused to keep their heads down, and, braver than all that, simply knew the truth and lived and spoke the truth, come hell or high water. The list of names of people like that is too long to read out. Robert Malone, physician and biochemist, did early work on mRNA technology and lipid nanoparticles.
That the genetic COVID-19 genetic injections cause far more harm than good.
Here's cardiologist Peter McCullough.
As a doctor, I have never seen something so injurious to the human body. It invades the brain. It invades the heart. It causes brain and heart damage. It invades the bone marrow. It stimulates antibodies to actually start to attack our own platelets and our other cells in our body. It causes blood clotting and damage to blood vessels like we've never seen.
How about Professor of Medicine Jay Bhattacharya, co-author of the Great Barrington Declaration that opposed lockdown restrictions from the start?
For young men, the mRNA vaccines cause myocarditis at unacceptable rates.
And oncologist Professor Angus Dalgleish.
Decades of research have demonstrated the risks of foreign DNA integrating into human cells, leading to potentially catastrophic outcomes.
And then critical care physician Pierre Corey, early champion of the use of ivermectin to treat COVID.
My first piece of advice, do not get vaccinated ever again with an mRNA vaccine. Do not let family members get vaccinated.
So many voices who risked it all in the interest only of saving lives. Physicians, virologists, research scientists, all of them demonstrably deeply credible in the context of talking about the so-called pandemic. The list is long, too long to read out, as I said. But for me, there's none more deserving of naming than Dr. Mike Yeadon, former Vice President of Big Pharma giant Pfizer, no less. Before his retirement, Mike had racked up more than 30 years' experience as a professional research scientist working in biotechnology, primarily in the pharmaceutical industry. I first started listening to Mike online. So many of us found like minds online. Mike's videos, frankly, scared the living daylights out of me. But maybe that's just me. I can only testify to my own reaction to what I heard him say and keep saying. He was talking about the products that were pushed as vaccines. Vaccines against the thing we had learned to call COVID-19. Having found him, I made a point of listening to everything he had to say on the subject. He'd worked for Pfizer after all, and at the highest level, he knew the beast of which he spoke. Somehow, and I don't remember precisely how, Mike and I got in touch with one another directly. We spoke on the phone, we had video calls together. When he fled the country, and he did flee the country, so intense were the attacks on his name and reputation, we still kept in touch. Then he came and visited with my family and I here in Stirling. We sat in the back garden and he told us face to face what I had previously only heard him say on the phone or from a screen. I had never doubted his sincerity, but spending time with him face to face only underlined my conviction that he spoke not only from a place of hard-won professional knowledge, but also from the heart. It's worth pointing out that Mike was enjoying a comfortable retirement when the so-called pandemic was dropped on all our heads. He had no material, financial need to put his head above the parapet, none whatever, no desire for fame, far less infamy. Had he done what so many did and just kept his head down and his mouth shut, he would have continued to enjoy a comfortable and quiet life. He'd be right where he was back then. But despite all that, his conscience would not let him be, and so he said what he said, and he has kept saying it, come what may. He had nothing to gain from his course of action over the past 4 years, and everything to lose, and he has lost a lot. His professional reputation, not the least of it. If I was to repeat, even now, what Mike has had to say about the gene therapies that were marketed as vaccines, about how such products are conjured into being, about the nature of the pharmaceutical industry itself, and most specifically about what he understands to be the thinking and intent behind those products that have gone into the arms of half the population of the planet, the resultant content would be immediately taken down, at the very least. I can't be certain, but I'd say there are good grounds for suggesting Dr. Mike Yeadon may be one of the most censored people on the internet and social media. It can be hard to find what he has had to say, although much of it is still out there. I've been looking around at some of it today. It's only my opinion, but I say with hand on heart that it's important to make the effort to find him, read what he's written, and listen to what he has had to say. The reason I'm saying this now is that Mike recently addressed the conference in Vienna, Austria, organised by a group called Impfopfer, a word meaning in English vaccine victim. It's Austria's largest association speaking up for those harmed by the jabs. I think it's safe enough for me to say Mike told the conference that based on his experience, working to design, build and deliver to the public products that might correctly be described as vaccines is the work of several years at least. A decade. He said the official timeline for the so-called COVID vaccines was impossibly short, that to invent, research, test, evaluate, manufacture, gain authorization for and launch a complex new biological product in under a year, as we were told had happened, is impossible, regardless of how many people are involved and how much money is spent. It's surely fair to report also that during his presentation to the conference, Mike made allegations about the vaccine industry, as we have it today, that are nothing less than staggering. I'll leave that thought there. For anyone wanting to hear Mike's words straight from the horse's mouth, so to speak, there is a video online. I've never in my life been one for campaigning for much of anything as such. I don't march. I don't write letters to elected officials. But I would like to say that in my opinion, it's beyond time, way beyond time, for a campaign for the return to the public square where he might finally properly be listened to of Dr. Mike Yeadon. It's my opinion that the general public has the right to hear what this credentialed expert in biotech and the inner workings of the pharmaceutical industry has to say. For years, literally years, it was extremely difficult even to ask questions about the products marketed as COVID vaccines, products that are still available and still being offered to people. Time has moved on. The mainstream media agenda has deliberately moved on to coverage of war, the climate hoax, World War III. I say there's an effort, coordinated and deliberate, to have the world forget about what they called a pandemic. There have been no consequences whatever for the innumerable and catastrophic harms done, and that's clearly the point. The message, even if it's a subliminal message, is don't look over there at that. The pandemic, for example, that's ancient history. Look here at this. It would appear to matter not at all that some of the truth is out there now. This week on GB News, just as a for instance, it was reported that the so-called COVID vaccines pose a 112,000% greater risk of causing brain clots and strokes than do flu shots. 112,000%. Anyone trying to report that kind of finding a couple of years ago, well, their feet wouldn't have touched the ground on the way to the padded cell and the straitjacket. The loosening of the vice that once held all questions about the jabs tightly in its jaws is, I say, what they call a limited hangout. None of it seems to make any difference, like the difference that might see the guilty hung out to dry. What might make the difference, you never know, would be if more people were given the opportunity to listen to Dr. Mike Yeadon. Just one man, but a man with an important perspective on all that has happened. I think it's reasonable to report that Mike describes the mRNA jabs as gene-based products containing a string of genetic information, that the gene-based injections cause the body to manufacture a foreign spike protein, that before COVID arrived there were no such products in routine use anywhere in the world. I think I can say that much. And also that Mike quotes peer-reviewed scientific papers published as early as 2012, showing that the liquid nanoparticles, LNPs, the little balls of fat, tiny, tiny little balls of fat that carry and deliver the genetic material, lead to a disproportionate deposition of their genetic payload into the ovaries. The ovaries. He said this was proven in testing when injected into animals and people. Quote from Mike, "I remember the day I read that paper, I really couldn't sleep. The person who chose to use lipid nanoparticles to formulate the Moderna and Pfizer products knew perfectly well that what they would do is allow them to drift all through your body, through membranes as if they weren't there, and disproportionately deposit in your ovaries." Dr. Mike Yeadon has a great deal more to say about the mRNA vaccines, but as I have said, if I were to repeat it here, there would be consequences I can do without. Consequences utterly unlike any so far faced by any of those who promoted the jabs, the lockdowns, the masks, and the rest of the unprecedented draconian reactions to what they called the pandemic. It might all have been so different, but it wasn't allowed to be different. The whole point, all along, was silence and censorship and control, insisting on only one unchallenged version of events. So that here we are now, with the excess deaths, the harms, and the rest. If Mike's message had been allowed out years ago, well, who knows? Who knows? We'll never know now how different things might have been. But then that was the point, wasn't it? The way things turned out, the way things are, is the way they were meant to be.
My name is Dr. Mike Yeadon.